The book of Ruth represents man's sin of not trusting God and obeying his own wisdom. The place of geography in the story is important in that there is an effect of geography on the weather and on this particular temptation. The situation that led to Elimelech's sin was a persistent drought throughout the entire area of Bethlehem. Because of the temptation and the drought, the stage is now set for Elimelech to look beyond God's provision. The book of Ruth gives an overarching example of how disobedience to God can lead to destruction, but also is followed by a returning to God and enjoying his forgiveness. The book of Ruth is an historic account, or an historic narrative to be more precise, set in the era of the warlords. The era of the warlords is at the time of the judges, and means that Ruth took place during this era of the judges, the books that are chronologically set just before the book of Ruth. The date of the writing of the book of Ruth is set at the beginning of the post-exilic period. According to the Babylonian Talmud, Samuel was the author of Ruth at the end of the 11th century BC. However, according to Frederick W. Bush, the authorship is unknown, meaning that the author is anonymous, which doesn't present a problem for this Old Testament book, because that was the practice of writing of the ancient world in general. Elimelech and Naomi took their sons Mahlon and Chilion to Moab. This was done to escape the drought that was in Bethlehem at the time. Naomi's sons married Moabite women. One of the women's name was Ruth. Elimelech and his sons died. Naomi returns to Bethlehem, and Ruth accompanies her. Ruth works to supply sustenance for herself and Naomi by gleaning grain in the fields of Boaz. Boaz is a kinsman redeemer for Elimelech's family, along with Naomi. Ruth marries Boaz. Naomi regains her inheritance. Ruth and Boaz have a child and become part of David's genealogy. David's genealogy then leads to Christ. The town of Bethlehem is situated on a small mountain, from which one can gain a view of the mountains and the land of Moab, which during this time was free from drought. Moab lays across the Dead Sea from Bethlehem, and travel to the area was not easy. It was in view from Bethlehem and could be seen to be potentially wetter and more fertile. The route from Bethlehem to Moab was one of two ways. One of the routes was to go north over the arc of the Dead Sea. The second route was to the south and down the ascent of Ziz. The ascent of Ziz is referred to in 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 16. Both of these routes, to the north over the ark, or to the south down the ascent of Ziz, were well known to the shepherds at the time. Looking at the geographical setting, Bethlehem is 5 miles south of Jerusalem and lies just behind the crest of the watershed ridge. A watershed is the area from which all precipitation flows to a single stream or set of streams. Bethlehem's geographical position in relation to the watershed makes it an area of withering heat and famine. From the watershed ridge to Jericho, there is a drop of rainfall from 24 inches to 4 inches. From Bethlehem to the Dead Sea, there is a straight line trajectory of 15 miles, the distance between Bethlehem and the Dead Sea. Bethlehem was a base for the shepherds of the time. However, within the immediate circle of the town, there was an area that was most suitable for the growing of grains and crops that were popular in the area. These crops included barley and wheat. Bethlehem was very close to the transitional growing areas of the region. This meant that a marginal or inadequate rainfall would be the determiner of feast or famine. Elimelech was in Bethlehem when there was an inadequate amount of rain and developed a drought which led to the famine. Elimelech chose to leave the area. When he left this area, he also left his ancestral heritage, all in order to feed his family and not trust God to take care of him. Famines in the Promised Land were most often tests of faith by God, although sometimes they were methods of divine chastisement. Elimelech did not trust God and went to Moab. Because Elimelech had moved to Moab and taken his sons and wife with him, he began to assimilate to the culture, and his sons married Moabite women. Their names were Orpah and Ruth. The act of marrying these women violated Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 3, and added to the sin of Elimelech and his family. The choice that Elimelech made because he looked at the hills of Moab and thought they were better than where he was, and he refused to trust God, reminds one of Eve's choice to violate God's command, to look at what was pleasing to the eye, and to ignore God's direction. Elimelech rose each morning only to see his crops dead, and overlooking the brown fields, across the Dead Sea, he saw the tempting hills and slopes of Moab. Eve and her husband were cast out of their land of Eden for their sin. Elimelech and his wife left the Promised Land in the commission of sin. Elimelech and his family lived in Moab for 10 years. During this time, both his sons died and left widows. The sons' names were Mahlon and Chilion. Mahlon meaning sickly, and Chilion meaning weakly. With her husband and sons gone, Naomi is alone and without a family, and in a patriarchal society, she was really alone, in need of hesed, or unfailing kindness to the helpless. Naomi makes the decision to return to the Promised Land because she had heard that God had come to the aid of his people. Naomi then makes an evangelistic warning to her daughters-in-law. Orpah, after Naomi's talk, decides to go back to her gods of Moab. But Ruth accepts the God of Israel and accompanies Naomi back to Bethlehem. When Naomi and Ruth had arrived in Bethlehem, the people who knew Naomi before she left didn't recognize her. Perhaps she had aged beyond her years because of the struggle that she had survived, the loss of the husband, her sons, and the arduous journey from Bethlehem to Moab and from Moab back to Bethlehem. Naomi changed her name to Mara, which means bitterness. This was to show that she was in a time of difficulty. The names of people in this culture reflected who they were. It reflected the essence of the person. When they had arrived in Bethlehem, it was the time of the spring harvest, which is in early April and extends into late May. During this time of harvest, Ruth goes to the field of Boaz to gather grain. Boaz is from the clan of Elimelech. The clan is one of the nested family groups. The household was a subgroup of an extended family or clan. 2 or 3 clans lived together in a village or a series of neighboring villages. Naomi encourages Ruth to glean as stated in Leviticus chapter 19, verses 9 through 10, chapter 23, verse 22, and Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 19. These verses provide the rulings for providing food for the needy, the stranger, the orphan, and the widow. In chapter 2, verse 3 of Ruth, it seems to say that Ruth found the field of Boaz by chance, but it is more likely that it was by God's providence. After gleaning in the field, Ruth came back to Naomi with 3/5 of a bushel of barley. Naomi finds out that it was Boaz who had blessed Ruth through God's direction. It was also revealed that Boaz is a kinsman redeemer to the family of Elimelech and to Naomi. The kinsman redeemer has several responsibilities in Scripture and is a very important part of the book of Ruth and an important part for Israel and mankind. The responsibilities of a kinsman redeemer are to avenge the death of a family member, Numbers chapter 35, verses 19 to 21, to buy back the property when it is sold to pay back a debt, Leviticus chapter 25, verse 25, redeem a relative when he has sold himself into slavery, Leviticus 25, verses 47 to 49. Boaz may bear the responsibility of a Levitical marriage and preserve the name of his cease, as outlined in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 5. Naomi prepared Ruth for a proposal to Boaz for marriage. This is so Boaz would be able to complete his kinsman redeemer responsibilities. Boaz was either a widower or was never married. Naomi instructs Ruth to make herself presentable by anointing herself with oils and perfumes. Ruth enters the threshing floor area at night and lies down next to Boaz, after first uncovering his feet. Boaz is startled awake by the cold night air on his feet. He notices a body lying next to him. Ruth identifies herself, and she asks Boaz to spread the corner of his garment over her. This spreading of the garment is a marriage proposal as outlined in Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 8. In this culture, all legal agreements are made at the town gate. Therefore, in order to legalize this kinsman redeemer agreement that Boaz is about to embark on, he calls for a legal assembly at the town gate. He does this because it is realized that there is another closer kinsman redeemer. This unnamed redeemer is offered the opportunity to act out his responsibilities as a kinsman redeemer, but he refuses. The reason that he gives for refusing is that he did not want to pollute his seed by marrying a Moabite woman and forfeit his own inheritance. This is outlined in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 3 through 4. Adhering to this law, the letter of the law misses the intent and the spirit of the law. Nevertheless, this gives Boaz the opportunity to act as kinsman redeemer and be Naomi's redeemer. Boaz abides by the kinsman redeemer law and promises to marry Ruth. Boaz buys Naomi's property, redeems the perpetuation of Elimelech's name. He takes Ruth as his wife and thereby maintains the ownership of Elimelech's property to his family. These benefits satisfy the qualification for this marriage to be considered a Leviric marriage. Boaz had divided property that was left by Elimelech. This land was lived on by a squatter for those 10 years that Elimelech and his family had spent in Moab. Naomi, when she returned, was unable to buy the property back. Boaz, acting as a kinsman redeemer, bought the property back and became Naomi's redeemer. Now, as Naomi's new son through marriage, Boaz ensured that she would receive the financial security of Elimelech's ancestral land. Boaz marries Ruth, and the lineage of David is continued. David's genealogy in the book of Ruth before Boaz is truncated. David's line leads to Christ as the kinsman redeemer for Israel. Boaz's work as kinsman redeemer is a foreshadow of Christ's position as redeemer. This redeemer is for Israel, the kinsman redeemer for her, and the kinsman redeemer for mankind. Eve was given the promise that she would be the genealogical link to the Son who would bring judgment upon Satan. This lineage continued through David leads to Eve's son who will complete the work. That son is Christ. The land is central to man's beginnings and to Israel's relationship with God. It is the geography of the land that affects its hydrology, the rainfalls, the droughts, all those things that allow God to be able to move man where he needs him to go, to test man. It is integral and a part of God's attendance to his people. The narrative of Ruth is a parallel to mankind's sin and redemption. Adam and Eve lose the land of Eden. The sin is inherited by mankind. Eve is given the promise of the coming Redeemer. This is accomplished through Christ. Man and the land, then, are both redeemed. The narrative of Ruth can also be seen as a parallel to Israel's sin and redemption, of Israel's relationship with her God. Israel loses the land of promise through disobedience to God. The Messiah, Redeemer, is Christ, who regains the land for Israel. The works cited for this presentation were the Moody Bible Commentary, editor Louis A. Barbieri and others, the New Moody Atlas of the Bible, Barry Beetzel, the World Commentary of Old Testament, Volume 9, by Frederick Bush, the Encyclopedia Britannica, On the Reliability of the Old Testament, by Kenneth Anderson Kitchen, the New International Version Study Bible, an Old Testament Theology on Exegetical, Canonical, and Thematic Approach by Bruce K. Waltke, and Rose Then and Now Bible Map Atlas with Biblical Background and Culture by Paul Wright.